December 24th, 1914. Winter had locked the Western Front in ice. For the men shivering in the mud, the first Christmas of the Great War offered only biting wind and frostbite. Between the opposing lines lay no man's land. To lift your head above the parapet meant drawing an immediate sniper bullet. Survival required staying low, watching the wire and waiting for the next order to kill. But as evening fell, the defying sound of the conflict, the relentless thunder of heavy artillery, stopped entirely. For men conditioned to continuous bombardment, this quiet was alarming. Many gripped their rifles tighter in the dark, certain the silence was the prelude to a massive night assault. Instead of a barrage, tiny pinpricks of light appeared across darkness. German infantrymen were lining their earthworks with candles and small trees, their voices drifting over the snow in a chorus of Stille Nacht. On the other side, British troops listened in disbelief. Some suspected a trick. Others instinctively sang back in English. Then came the ultimate risk. Figures climbed out of the German trenches and stood entirely exposed in the kill zone. They carried no weapons, their hands were empty. In that freezing dark, the opposing soldiers faced a stark decision. They could pull the trigger, as their training demanded, or they could trust the vulnerability of the men standing across from them. Slowly, cautiously, British troops began to leave their own dugouts. They navigated the cratered earth, walking toward the center of the battlefield to meet the enemy. Hands were shaken. Men who had spent months trying to slaughter one another traded rations for tobacco, shared pieces of chocolate, and pulled out crumpled photographs of their wives and children back home. In the freezing light of Christmas morning, they posed for photographs together. Stripped of their rifles, it was suddenly difficult to distinguish the British farm boys from the German factory workers. The pause in fighting allowed both sides to finally retrieve the bodies of their fallen comrades. British and German troops dug graves side by side, listening as chaplains read joint prayers over the frozen earth. The misery of the trenches had forged a strange bond. The propaganda posters in London and Berlin demanded absolute hatred, but out in the mud, the soldiers recognized their own suffering in the faces of their enemies, erasing the ideological lines drawn by their empires. Someone produced a makeshift ball, and massive, chaotic games of football broke out among the craters. Laughter echoed across a landscape designed exclusively for death. Miles behind the lines, field telephones began to ring. When High Command received the reports of fraternization, panic set in immediately. The entire war effort relied on dehumanization. If the men on the front lines realized their targets were exactly like them, the willingness to pull the trigger would vanish. To the British command, the truce represented a collapse of frontline discipline that threatened the entire chain of command. The German High Command shared this intolerance for peace. To the generals coordinating the grand strategy, a spontaneous ceasefire was an infection that had to be eradicated. The logic of the war machine was absolute. Its survival depended entirely on the continued hatred of the men in the mud. If the soldiers refused to fight, the empires would lose their power entirely. Urgent dispatches flooded the front. Commanders issued strict orders forbidding any further contact, explicitly threatening field executions and court-martials for anyone caught crossing the lines. The soldiers were ordered back into their holes. Reluctantly, weapons were raised. With the crack of a rifle and the violent flash of a machine gun, the ceasefire dissolved. To ensure the men kept their heads down and their hatred sharp, officers ordered continuous, heavy covering fire. Gas masks were readied, and the relentless rhythm of automatic weapons returned. Massive artillery batteries miles away were commanded to shell the very center of no man's land, systematically churning the earth where the men had just played and prayed together. The machine reasserted control. A few days of shared humanity had been completely swallowed by the industrial appetite of the war. With the borders locked back into a brutal, unyielding trench system, the generals realized a quick victory in France was impossible. They needed new battlegrounds to break the deadlock. This map illustrates the European boundaries of the Central Powers at the conflict's onset, boxed in by allied nations. To relieve the pressure, Germany and Austria-Hungary looked southeast, seeking an alliance to stretch British and Russian resources to the breaking point. They found it in the Ottoman Empire. The Turkish entry threw hundreds of thousands of fresh troops into the conflict, expanding the fighting deep into new territories. The battle lines bled into the Middle East. Combat erupted around critical global arteries, threatening vital trade routes like the Suez Canal, which the British Empire relied upon for survival. Desperate to knock the Ottomans out of the fight, the Allies launched immense amphibious assaults. Troops were ferried onto distant, heavily defended beaches like Gallipoli, only to find themselves trapped in new, impossible stalemates. The localized tragedy of the Western Front had metastasized into an intercontinental war of attrition. The brief window for peace was permanently closed. The Great War was only beginning its most brutal phase. In the months to come, the names Gallipoli, Verdun, and the Somme would introduce the world to entirely new scales of slaughter.